Leonid Brezhnev was in power for 18 long years, and he spent that time collecting cars and non performing allies across the Third World while building an empire that his economy couldn't afford to sustain. When I look at the rise and fall of the Soviet Union, I see the story of an oil addiction that ultimately proved fatal, a cautionary tale that explains both how Putin came to power and why his current strategy is doomed to repeat the same catastrophic mistakes. Brezhnev thought he was manifesting Russian power on the global stage, but he was actually constructing an elaborate Ponzi scheme that could only survive as long as energy prices remained high. When those prices collapsed, so did the empire. And the lessons from this economic disaster should terrify anyone watching Putin make exactly the same errors today. The Soviet economy under Brezhnev became dangerously dependent on oil and gas revenues in ways that most people don't fully understand. By the peak of the Brezhnev era, energy exports accounted for as much as 55% of government revenues, making the entire Soviet system hostage to global commodity markets that Moscow could not control. This wasn't supposed to happen according to communist economic theory, which emphasized industrial production and socialist planning rather than raw material extraction. But Soviet industry was so inefficient and uncompetitive that the only products that could earn hard currency on international markets were oil, gas, and other natural resources that required minimal processing or technological sophistication. This created a vicious cycle where the Soviet Union became increasingly dependent on energy exports to finance everything from military spending to consumer goods imports, while the domestic economy stagnated due to lack of investment in productivity improvements or technological innovation. Brezhnev used this energy windfall not to modernize the Soviet economy or improve living standards for ordinary citizens, but to pursue an incredibly expensive foreign policy that aimed to project Soviet power across the globe. He was collecting non performing allies in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, countries that provided minimal strategic value but required enormous subsidies to maintain their loyalty to Moscow. Cuba alone cost the Soviet Union billions of dollars annually in economic aid, military assistance, and subsidized trade relationships. Similar arrangements with Vietnam, Angola, Ethiopia, and dozens of other client states created a massive financial burden that grew larger every year as these countries demanded more aid while providing little in return except symbolic support for Soviet positions in international forums. The fundamental problem was that most of these allies were economically basket cases that needed constant financial life support to avoid collapse. They weren't choosing to align with the Soviet Union because of ideological affinity or genuine partnership. They were essentially welfare recipients who stayed loyal only as long as the subsidies kept flowing. This meant that Soviet foreign policy success was measured not by the strategic value of alliances, but by Moscow's willingness to spend money on countries that couldn't sustain themselves economically or politically. It was a recipe for financial disaster disguised as geopolitical triumph. What made this even worse was that the Soviet Union was simultaneously engaged in an arms race with the United States that required enormous military expenditures on top of the foreign aid commitments. Nuclear weapons, conventional forces, space programs, intelligence operations, every aspect of superpower competition demanded resources that the Soviet economy couldn't afford to allocate without sacrificing domestic needs. But Brezhnev and his colleagues convinced themselves that they could have it all: global power projection, military parity with America, extensive foreign commitments, and rising living standards at home. This was economic fantasy, but it was politically irresistible because admitting the trade-offs would have required acknowledging the fundamental weaknesses of the Soviet system. The illusion could be maintained only as long as oil prices remained high enough to generate the revenue needed to finance all these commitments simultaneously. During the 1970s, Middle Eastern conflicts and supply disruptions sent energy prices soaring, providing the Soviet Union with windfall profits that seemed to validate Brezhnev's expansive approach to foreign policy. Soviet leaders began to believe that high energy prices were the new normal and that they could count on this revenue stream indefinitely to support their global ambitions. They made long-term commitments based on short-term price spikes, locking themselves into financial obligations that could only be sustained if energy markets remained favorable forever. This was the classic resource curse in action: temporary commodity windfalls creating the illusion of permanent prosperity and encouraging policies that were unsustainable once prices returned to normal levels. When oil prices began declining in the early 1980s, the entire Soviet system started unraveling with shocking speed. Suddenly, the government couldn't afford to maintain military spending at previous levels, continue subsidizing client states around the world, and provide adequate consumer goods for Soviet citizens. The choice was between cutting foreign commitments or imposing even greater hardships on the Soviet population. And the Communist Party chose to squeeze ordinary citizens rather than admit that their global ambitions were unrealistic. This created a downward spiral where economic problems generated political discontent, which required increased spending on internal security, which reduced resources available for productive investment, which worsened economic performance even further. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power inheriting this impossible situation, and he repeatedly acknowledged that the Soviet Union simply couldn't continue living the way it had under Brezhnev. His attempts to reform the system through glasnost and perestroika were essentially efforts to find a sustainable economic model that didn't depend on unsustainable energy revenues and ruinous foreign commitments. But the reforms that might have saved the Soviet economy proved politically destabilizing because they required acknowledging that the entire Brezhnev era approach to foreign policy had been a massive mistake that had nearly bankrupted the country. The territorial implications of this economic collapse were staggering and provide a perfect case study of how resource dependency can lead to imperial disintegration. At the beginning of the 1980s, the Soviet Union controlled a vast empire stretching from Eastern Europe to Central Asia, with client states and military bases spanning the globe. By the end of 1991, Russia had lost not only its satellite states in Eastern Europe, but also the constituent republics that had been part of the Soviet Union itself. Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, the Baltic states, the Caucasus region, Central Asia, all of these territories slipped away as the central government in Moscow proved unable to maintain the economic and military resources necessary to hold the empire together. This wasn't gradual decline, but sudden collapse, as the financial foundation of Soviet power simply vanished when energy revenues could no longer support imperial overstretch. The lesson that Putin should have learned from this history is that resource-dependent economies are inherently unstable, and that using temporary commodity windfalls to finance unsustainable foreign adventures is a recipe for eventual disaster. Instead, Putin has repeated exactly the same pattern that destroyed his predecessors, using high energy prices during the 2000s to rebuild Russian military capabilities and pursue increasingly aggressive foreign policy goals. Like Brezhnev, Putin has collected non-performing allies who provide minimal strategic value but require enormous subsidies: Belarus, Syria, various African dictatorships, and other client states that drain Russian resources while contributing little to Russian security or prosperity. Like Brezhnev, Putin has assumed that energy prices would remain high enough to finance both domestic needs and foreign adventures indefinitely. Like Brezhnev, Putin has prioritized short-term geopolitical gains over long-term economic sustainability, gambling that Russia's oil and gas resources would provide enough revenue to support whatever commitments he chose to make. The results are becoming painfully obvious as Putin's war in Ukraine drains Russian resources at an unsustainable pace while international sanctions reduce access to energy markets that provided the foundation for Russian power. Russia is once again discovering that commodity-dependent economies are vulnerable to external shocks and that imperial ambitions require resources that extractive economies cannot reliably provide. The irony is that Putin could have learned from Soviet mistakes and used Russia's energy wealth to diversify the economy, improve living standards, and build genuine partnerships based on mutual benefit rather than subsidized dependency. Instead, he chose to repeat the Brezhnev playbook with predictably disastrous results. The pattern is clear for anyone willing to see it. Resource-dependent empires that overextend themselves financially and militarily inevitably face collapse when commodity prices fall or external circumstances change. Russia is in the early stages of this process right now, and understanding the Brezhnev precedent helps predict how this story is likely to end. The question is whether Putin will recognize the danger and change course, or whether he will continue doubling down on unsustainable policies until the entire system collapses around him, just as it did for his Soviet predecessors.